I live with my family in an extremely old house in the British countryside. For some background, it's your typical old English farmhouse. There's a big front door in the middle, and to your left you have your kitchen, and to your right your family room, with all the bedrooms upstairs. It was quite a nice space, and we had other buildings surrounding us that had been converted into spaces for us to use as children, that used to house pigs and other animals. However, those had been moved further afield, so that we could enjoy our privacy and not have to worry about any animals while we were just focusing at home. That's besides the point though. This happened about 15 years ago, when I still lived with my family. I was the eldest of 4 girls, and we were all very content to sleep one night. It was your standard evening. All of us had gone to bed, and my parents were probably downstairs watching TV. I'm quite a light sleeper, and would always hear when they came up the stairs, and just like every night, I did this time as well. I found it a bit harder to go to sleep than usual. Something was pressing on my mind, so I told myself I needed to go grab a drink of water. I always made sure to go down the stairs carefully. Being a very old house, creaks are prevalent, and you have to know where to step exactly in order to make minimal to no sound. I got downstairs and just stared into the darkness through the kitchen window, while slowly taking sips of my water, contemplating and thinking about what I had to do tomorrow at school. I'm being very absent-minded, and I'm not really super tired, so I was just waiting for the water to hopefully make me feel a bit full, and like I needed to go back to sleep. Just as I'm staring out though, do I notice something? It's also worth mentioning at this point that no lights were on in the house, as we tried to be as energy efficient as possible, and it was a fairly bright moon outside, so it wasn't necessary in order for me to see where I was going at the kitchen. I see a figure begin to approach from the garden. Now I also need to point out we live in the middle of nowhere, with no other houses around. I think the closest might be about a mile away, so very isolated. We don't get along well with our neighbours, if you can even call them neighbours at that distance, so it was unlikely to be them. This person is making their way with haste towards the house, and I wonder what they want. I wait to see if they're even going to come to the house, or go up our driveway into the road, before I make a decision to wake up my mum, because I know she'll be pissed. I stand there in the dark, and the person arrives at the door, studying it, and walks around the house a little, looking at the windows and looking at the back door. He can't see me. At least I don't think he can. He hasn't noticed me at all. I didn't think I was standing somewhere particularly dark, and yet here I am completely unnoticed. I don't really know what to do. Then he comes back around to the front door, and he pulls something off his back. It's black, shiny, and he starts wedging it in. At that moment it all clicks. It's a crowbar, but I can't move. I'm frozen to my spot. He makes quick work of the door, gets in, and even though it's made a fair amount of noise, none of my family have woken up or done anything about it. He goes into the hallway, and I can no longer see him, and am paralyzed with fear, whether to shout for them to wake up, whether to run and hide in a safe spot and hope that he doesn't venture upstairs, or to do something reckless and announce my presence in the hopes that I scare him off. I choose option 4 and remain glued to the ground, paralyzed with fear and unable to move. Just as I start to get brave, I think the best thing to do would be to let him know I'm there, and to hopefully scare him off. We have all of our kitchen knives in holders, so I just grab two that are conveniently in the slots and start approaching the door silently. I could see that he's made his way into our lounge, so I start approaching it ever so quietly, making sure to step where the creaks won't be heard, in order to jump scare him, in the hopes that he leaves out of fear. I get right to the door and hide next to the wall, waiting for the opportune moment. He's currently looking under the sofa and around our bookshelves, in hopes to find something valuable, I suppose. I stand there, panic-stricken, waiting for the right moment, when I see something that I can't explain. He's looking underneath the sofa. If he would have turned his head any more, he would have probably seen me, when a book flies off the shelf and lands to the floor with a thud. He visibly jumps, turns around, and another book flies off the shelf and lands on the floor. I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. Not only was there a strange man in my house, but now books are flying off the shelves too? One more book comes down and lands right between his legs. It's not before long that he grabs his bag and runs as quickly as he can out of the house. I don't even think he noticed me as he left, as I took a few steps back in anticipation for him leaving. He runs out, and the loud stomping woke up my mum. She comes bolting down, shotgun in hand, ready to shout at someone. She sees the open door, and in the moonlight, someone running through the field. She turns to me, turns to the man, and congratulates me on scaring him off, and asks what happened. I explain how I saw him coming, was frightened, then he made entry, and when he was just looking around our lounge, did books start flinging themselves from the bookshelf, and that scared him off without me even having to announce my presence. My mother says that I should always shout, always make noise before they enter, to scare them off, and to tell her and my dad as the ever bigger priority. We call the police, and of course nothing comes of it. They never find out who he was. But one burning question has always been left in my head. What happened? Was the house protecting itself? Is our house haunted? None of us had ever experienced anything remotely paranormal in the house, so I'm not really sure why, at that moment in time, did the house suddenly decide to develop a poltergeist that decided to leave just as quickly as well. Some things I'll never know the answer to, but I'm glad the house fought back, or whatever it was, to protect us from that home invader. When I was 8, my whole family gathered at my aunt's house for Christmas. Everyone was there. Being a Hispanic family, there was a number of us in the house. All the lights were on in every single room, and music was playing on both floors. The kitchen was abuzz with all the ruckus of cooking going on. Anyway, a few hours into it, at around 1 in the morning, the power goes out. Everything is dark and quiet. Some deliberation later, myself and my uncle volunteered to get to the cellar where the fuse box is. We walked to the back of the kitchen, through the door and down a flight of stairs into the cellar. This place is pitch black. There was a small window on the far side of the exterior part of the floor, yet no light came in, since it was just as dark outside. I place my hand on his right shoulder as he leads me through the room, trying to blindly make ourselves to a metal box against the wall. As we slowly make our way through the thick darkness, we hear something move up ahead. We assumed it to be rats or mice and moved on. We take another 5 steps when my uncle breaks the silence asking if I had just slapped him. I hadn't. We were alone down there, and if I were to have slapped him, it would have been heard in the quiet, which added to the confusion. He complained about feeling like he'd just been slapped on his back. Weird. We move on. 2 minutes later, we find the box. He returns the power to the upper floors, and the party continues, as if it never happened in the first place. After a while, my uncle started complaining about some weird sensation on his back. He described it as if it was static prickling him, almost like pins and needles. His wife asks him to lift up his shirt to inspect, and that's when we first notice the large handprint on his back, a clear red mark placed right on his left shoulder blade and going past his spinal cord. Upon some reflection and superstitious paranoia that comes with the Mexican culture, it was decided among my family that the handprint, coupled with the noise we heard downstairs, was an actual demon. We never found a logical explanation for the mark on his back. We were alone down there, and we would have been able to hear and feel some sort of impact against my uncle, since I was directly behind him, with my hand placed on his shoulder. I tried to find a logical explanation for everything, but this one was just plain weird and unnerving, that something was able to get between the two of us without either of us noticing. The fact that it was pitch black, and that we were admittedly completely exposed, doesn't help. This happened about 5 years ago. I live in a remote town in a fairly secluded part of the country. We don't get many visitors, but we do get trucks driving straight through town, as there is no bypass. It doesn't bother us. It's happened all the time. They always have to pass through the same road, which also situates our main store, Walmart, where we all pass for groceries. Now, this particular Walmart is on the smaller side. Anyway, I had just left my house one day and was going over to see a neighbor of mine. We needed to discuss some urgent business concerning the selling of land. As I was making my way over, I bumped into my friend on her bicycle. She was telling me all about her day, how she was getting divorced from her husband still, and all the stuff that went along with that. Generally sharing the woes of a 50-year-old woman who's lost pretty much everything. As you can imagine, it wasn't a fun conversation, but I digress. We were just talking amongst ourselves, and I was starting to get bored of her conversation. I really needed to go and see my friend, as she was already expecting me. So I politely excused myself and let her know that we should catch up over tea in the coming days. She gave me a little smile at the sign of friendship and invitation, and said that she would be over next week. I gladly agreed, and she went on her way, continuing on her bike to do whatever it is that she was going to do. So I went to my friend's house, had the talk I needed to, and was making my way back home. Please note, I was walking. Now, as I was making my way back, I look up the road and there's a hill. It's not a very big hill, but at the crest of the hill, that is when all vehicles tend to slow down, as the descent is the entrance into town. I look up the hill, and there is the lady I was speaking to earlier, coming down on her bike. I wonder if she can see me, and think for a moment if I should give her a wave, but realize that it wouldn't be long before she made it down, as there was still a little bit of a walk to my house, and we may just say hello then, if at all. I absent-mindedly continue my walk down, and I'm just passing a pub when I hear something there is a truck approaching from the hill. It crests and it makes its way down towards me. And then the sound that I will never forget occurred. I can't even begin to describe it, but it was just a sound of utter destruction. This lady that I had just spoken to, not even an hour ago, was now being trampled by the wheels of this gargantuan behemoth. She went underneath and underneath. Her bicycle was crushed, her body was destroyed, and blood was everywhere. It was like something out of a horror movie. Now, as many of you would expect, the truck slowed down. But you'd be wrong. The truck didn't slow down at all. In my mind, I wasn't sure if the truck driver had seen this lady at all, even though it was the middle of the day, and she was even wearing those reflective jackets. And now, she was being torn apart and smushed along the road. Part of me tries to forget this next part, as the truck just kept on driving, and just as quickly as it had entered our small town, made its way out of it and onto the horizon. I started having a panic attack. I was freaking out hardcore. This lady who I had just spoken to moments ago was now dead, and all in pieces along the road. I recall looking over, her mangled bike a mess on the floor, with the bloody remains of a hand still attached to the handlebars. Bystanders came, dialed 911, and I was in shock. To cut a long story short, the driver was stopped at the next town. There were bits of her body and blood scattered all over the road. They say from his reaction that he genuinely had no idea what he'd done, as when he got out of his truck when the police asked him to, only then did he look down and see the carnage which he had caused. The blood, the flesh, all over the wheels. He also had a meltdown. He was crying and was lost and inconsolable. I don't blame him. I wish there were a moral to this story. It's not like anyone was doing anything wrong. Perhaps the truck driver, for that split second as he was slowing down, absent-mindedly forgot to look and missed my friend completely. Who knows? I don't know if I'll ever know the truth. What I do know is that he was found not guilty. I'm not sure if he ever drove again, as I only loosely followed the case from the tidbits that were told to me from my other friends. But I still feel sorry for him. I don't know if he would ever drive again after that. I know I wouldn't. And of course for her and her family, and the loss that they suffered. It's not easy. All that I ask is to all you truckers out there, please pay attention on the roads, never overdo your hours, and drive responsibly. I think it's the most we can ask for. One night when I was in middle school, I was the only one awake in my house. It was 2 a.m. and I was in the basement, on the computer. All the TVs were off, and I had no music or anything playing, so it was dead quiet. All of a sudden, I hear a woman's voice at the top of my stairs of my bedroom saying, "Hello?" I thought it was my mum, even though it sounded nothing like her. So I reply, "Hello?" and hear nothing. So I went upstairs and turned the corner to my stairs to see no one, and everyone was still asleep. On another occasion, I was visiting my mum's side of the family down in Virginia, because my aunt's mother was incredibly sick and about to die. So as awful as this sounds, we basically went down and waited until she passed. It was about 3 a.m, and my cousins and I were playing old video games, when her parents came down and told us the news that her grandmother had passed. So we went up to bed and talked for a little bit, then finally turned off the lights and went to sleep. But all of a sudden, I felt as if someone was in the room with us. Out of nowhere, I sat up in bed to see a black shadow standing in the corner of the room waving at me. I stared at it for a good 10 minutes, until I woke up my cousin, telling her that her grandmother was with us. I don't know how I knew it was her, but it was just this feeling. She told me she felt nothing. It still, to this day, freaks me out when I think about it. A few years back, I lived in an apartment complex. It wasn't in a bad part of town. I even lucked out, somehow managing to move into the same building as a handful of friends of mine. I thought it was awesome. A couple of months after living there, I noticed things missing. It was never anything big, like my laptop or Xbox, but my iPod and camera, and a couple of other small things vanished. I knew I just left them out in the open on the counter, but then they were gone. I figured I just misplaced them because, again, they were small items. A few times I'd get ready to leave, and my bottom lock would be locked. Now personally, I don't put much stock into doorknob locks. They've always seemed really flimsy to me, and not worth the effort, so I only ever used my deadbolt. When people would come over, I'd close the door behind them and automatically lock the deadbolt. It was a reflex. Even when I was home alone, the door was locked, but never the knob. I even felt safer using it because the deadbolt had no keyhole on the outside of the door for someone to pick. 3 times the doorknob was locked when I went to leave the house, and even though I never used it, I rationalized that sure, I probably did lock it myself. I mean, what else could it be? One day, after living there for about 7 months, I am sitting in my living room and I hear some shuffling by my front door. Since my apartment was a 1-bedroom and fairly small, I could hear it easily. I got up and moved closer, standing maybe 4 feet away from it. My heart sank as I watched my doorknob twist ever so slowly. It turned, then the door pushed in, stopped by my deadbolt. At an antagonizingly slow pace, the person on the other side pulled it closed. The door softly clicked, and I watched and listened as they slid a key into my lock and locked the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. Have you ever seen something that restarts your brain? It was so unfathomable that you can't just take in the information. That's what this was. I wish I could say I snuck up to the door and banged against it, scaring the crap out of whoever was on the other side. But I didn't. I didn't do anything, because my brain couldn't actually comprehend that someone with a key was trying to get into my apartment while I was home. The only thing that saved me was my deadbolt. And before anyone says it was a friend or my husband with a spare, no. I had the only 2 copies, I thought. Because my husband was deployed. Not even family had a spare. Everything snapped into place after that. Someone had been sneaking into my apartment and stealing stuff, and doing God knows what while I was gone, and then relocking the door behind me. And they'd attempted to do it while I was there, locking my doorknob. I mean, how many times had they been in my apartment when I wasn't home? There's no way for me to know for sure, because like I said before, I can't lock the deadbolt from the outside. Logically, I knew it had to be someone who worked in the office, a maintenance man most likely. But since I didn't look through the peephole, I couldn't find out which of the 4 guys who worked there it was. About 6 months after moving out, a friend who still lived there told me that all of the maintenance men had been fired because all of them were reported creeping around apartments and likely suspected of stealing. While this isn't outright terrifying like some of these other stories, it's still scary, at least to me. And it's another reminder to lock your doors, even when you're home. We grew up in a small Midwestern factory town. Snowy, freezing winters and sweltering hot summers. My parents, mother and stepdad barely made ends meet. We moved from trailer home to cramped apartment multiple times over. When I was in 4th grade, my family finally bought a house. Not just any house, an enormous house. The only problem was that the house was split into a triplex, meaning 3 families could live there in separate quarters. Since we were still dirt poor, my parents, of course, had to rent out 2 of the 3. This meant our family of 6 lived in a 2-bedroom shack section of the home. The 2nd bedroom was really just a living room off the kitchen, which I shared with my sister and youngest brother. The door to our home was in the kitchen. My dog Pepe was a natural brawn protector. He weighed about 10 pounds, but he didn't let anything past his sight without an alert. It's 3 a.m. on a 100-degree August night with 0 air conditioning, windows with too many holes in the screens to leave open, as Midwest equals mosquitoes. Fans are running on full blast throughout the space, and I wake up to Pepe barking furiously at the end of my bed. At first, I just stared at him and asked him to be quiet, figuring that he had heard a noise from one of the neighbors. Then I hear a shuffle from the kitchen. I turned left and started to try and focus past the bright lights over the kitchen sink. Then I saw something move slightly, and upon meeting each other's gaze, they froze. There were 2 men standing in the kitchen. I will never forget their faces to this day. We just stared at each other for what felt like minutes. Pepe didn't back down, but he also wasn't about to leave his post at the end of my bed. We had saved Pepe from an abusive home earlier that year in the freezing winter. He took his job pretty seriously. His bark was so loud, I couldn't even think to scream. My naked mother suddenly flies out of the bedroom next to us, screaming at the 2 men. All that I remember is her screaming, confrontation, and her chest swinging wildly in the bright glare from the kitchen light. The tallest man, at least 6'5", quietly looks at her and says, "Wrong house." Connects eyes with me, and they both turn and exit, never to be seen again. My parents decided after that we should start locking our door at night. They justified the men by saying they were probably looking for the neighbors. They didn't call the police. This happened when I was about 12 to 13. During this time, my brother was diagnosed with cancer, so my mum was often at the hospital with him. She would randomly come home during the day to do laundry, pick up stuff, eat, and the like. At this time, my mother, brother, and I were also living at my grandparents' house. My grandparents have a 2-story house with a basement. There is a front door and to the left a staircase leading downstairs. The basement had 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a bathroom. When you entered the basement, you were immediately in the living room, which is where my mother slept. Then, you would go down a hall and find my room halfway down the hall, across from the bathroom, and my brother's room at the end of the hall. Sorry for the context. Anyway, One day I was extremely ill and stayed home sick. Both of my grandparents were at work and my mother was at the hospital with my brother. I was laying in bed, sleeping, when I was woken up by a really loud stomping coming from upstairs. I assumed it was my mum just coming home to get stuff and was pissed she was running around like a lunatic. I sat up in bed to go upstairs to yell at her, but when I sat up, it felt like my brain had a heartbeat and was beating against my skull. So I just laid back down and went back to sleep. I'm not sure if this next part actually happened, or if I just think it did because I was delusional from a fever. I swear, I kept hearing someone coming downstairs, as our stairs were quite noisy. At the time, I slept with the TV in my room on, so I thought the people/person kept hearing the TV and got freaked out. So I'd say maybe half an hour to an hour later, I woke up, forgetting the whole thing happened, and called my mum. She tells me to go upstairs and get some Dayquil to help me feel better. So I open my door, leading upstairs, and it's just freezing. So I stop for a minute and think, that's weird. I slowly walk up my stairs and my door is kicked wide open, and there's stuff everywhere. I immediately ran back downstairs and tried calling my mum, who of course didn't answer. So I call my grandma instead, and she tells me that I need to call the police. I call the police, and they tell me to go wait on the driveway, so I do. And of course, as soon as the cops and I are talking, the school bus, taking all the people I went to school with, passed right by my house. As soon as my grandma got home, she gave me the biggest hug, and I just lost it. I think it was the first time since I pieced it all together, I finally felt safe again. They ended up taking a portable DVD player, a Canon camera, and worst of all my great-grandmother's jewellery who had just passed away. I often think about what would have happened if I'd gone upstairs, and I don't think it would have been anything good. There were definitely a lot of sketchy things about the neighbourhood I lived in. For instance, the previous resident of the house which was next to mine had died from overdosing on drugs. A meth house burnt down the road last year, and about 2 months ago, there was a shooting down the road at 2 a.m. And a week before, there was an attempted break-in at one of our neighbours. For some background, I was in a temporary house with my cousin and his wife and baby. I had my own little experience, but you'd need to know what his wife experienced to make it all the more creepier. So this starts off nearly a month ago, while me and my cousin were at work. His wife heard a knocking on the front door and assumed it was just my stepdad, who usually comes over by his voice. He has a key to the house, so just decides to let him open the key by himself. But he just kept knocking and asking if anyone was home. She started to get a bit worried and called my stepdad to see if it was him. It wasn't. He says our address and then states he's from Apple trying to deliver a package. The thing is, the closest Apple store is about an hour and a half away, and we hadn't ordered anything. He leaves after about 20 minutes, and then my stepdad comes over and takes her to his house. He suspected our neighbours were being watched by robbers, thinking about breaking in soon. But imagine if she'd decided to open the door alone with a baby. Nothing else happens, but we're still on guard. Fast forward to this week. My cousin's family temporary stay is over, and they leave. So I'm home alone that day. I'm moving my things to my parents for now. I'm taking out some Amazon boxes to the garbage, and decide, with that sketchy encounter, I should probably scratch out my information on the box with my pocket knife. I flip open and start but I hear a rustling in the woods. I look for a second, expecting nothing more than a squirrel or a loose dog that's always coming around. But I see a person in a white hoodie from what I guess would be about 25 feet away. The rustling stops, and I can't see them anymore due to the dense trees. I'm stunned for a few seconds. I'm the only one there, and I only have a pocket knife. I don't even run inside for some reason, I just casually walk. Once I get inside, I stand in the kitchen, maybe being too scared to move. I think, what should I do? Call the cops? Call one of my parents? I just decide to call my stepdad, who luckily for me, was already on the way to the house to collect some stuff. He arrives 10 minutes later and looks around and doesn't find anything or anyone. I leave to work with all my valuables already in the car before this happened, and I'm definitely not going back alone for the rest of my things. Now I'm glad we're all out of that place. I'm hoping they don't decide to break in while nobody's home, but there really is nothing of value left, unless they want to steal my leftover clothes and blankets. The thought of having to live in fear because some scum want to try and steal our stuff irritates me. I hope we never meet. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekend nights when I was very young, because my sister was a light sleeper and I could lay awake until dawn. But of course, I always end up sleeping on the couch because Nick at night made me tired. So one night, I wake up to this prickly feeling, like an insect, just bolted into a sitting position, and I started staring out the window. We live in rural Georgia, so you can imagine the magnitude of trees in perfect light cast from the moon. I see a silhouette of someone in this tree. The family dog dashes to the window and is snarling into the glass. Terrified, I run into my parents' room and try to explain to my parents that there is a strange person outside. Dad grabs something defensive and darts outside with the dog to beat the wax off the hothead. I tremble in Mama's arms until Dad comes home and says he saw no one and goes to bed. I decide to sleep in my regular bed. I fill in my sister as to what happened. Dad is making regular sounds in the house with a cup of coffee, and we are still, and I finally think that I can sleep. Nope. I notice the man outside my window. From what I can see in the moonlight, he gives me a hush signal and runs away. Just turns around and runs in a straight line away. I swear, I couldn't stop crying for what felt like hours. This story took place in late 2014. I am a female from Australia, based in southeast Queensland, and truck driving at the time. I was transporting horses all throughout Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria. For some context, at that time of year, a lot of horses had to go to the Hunter Valley in central New South Wales for the breeding season, and there are two main roads that I would take. The first road is the New England Highway, a direct south run to the Hunter Valley, just under 700 kilometers. It has a good road surface, but had a lot of hills, ranges, and towns to go up, down, and through, making it hard on the horses, straining on the corners, and the constant changes in speed. The other road was a bit to the west, and about 50 kilometers longer than the New England one, but the one I preferred to travel, as it was mostly flat the whole way, and half the number of towns to slow down for, making it easier for the horses in my truck. When the glitch happened, I was coming home. so heading north on the Western Road. It had been a long day, but I had a couple of hours sleep and a cup of coffee with lunch. It was about 3 in the afternoon, and I was just leaving the town of Nibiri, about halfway point on my trip. On the north side of town, you would go over the railway tracks. There is a big overpass, and I remember going over the tracks and starting to speed up for the 100km/h sign, when things started to shimmer, and I could hear a soft ringing in my ears suddenly. I was in a completely different place. The sun was now low on the horizon. There were small lots of land with houses, trucks, and large gardens on either side of the road. I had been speeding when I came to, but quickly slowed back down and pulled off to the side of the road. As I was doing it, I realized I was now on the north side of a town called Gundiwindi. I had planned to stop there to fuel up the truck and get another coffee and some dinner, but I was now on the north side, past the truck stop, and couldn't remember any of the trip from Narabi to here. Let me give you some details of the road between the two towns. First, there's over 220 kilometers, or 136 miles, between these big two towns. There are half a dozen smaller towns, more like a group of houses around a pub, but if you blink you'd miss them, that you had to slow down for and navigate through. Traffic lights, bridges, roundabouts, corners, roadworks. Moore is a bigger town in the middle, and at the time before the bypass was put in, you had to go through the main street that had a couple of hard corners with crappy roundabouts you had to take extra care with, all of which I should not have forgotten. I was freaked out, but still needed fuel for the truck. I carefully turned around and made my way to the truck stop, fueled the truck, parked it out of the way, got a coffee and a meat pie, and stayed there in the truckies lounge for a while to work out what happened. I had lost close to 3 hours of time, and I don't think I'd fallen asleep or spaced out or anything like that. It was like I had just driven through a wormhole and came back out on the road. I still had to get the horses to their home, so had to get moving again. The rest of the trip went well, and it was very late to the point of being early when I parked at the depot and jumped on my bunk to sleep. In the morning, while clearing the truck ready to go again, my boss came out to tell me what I had for my next trip. After she finished telling me about my pickups, she said that she had a look at my movements on her computer, from the GPS tracker in my truck to check times, and you may have guessed, it hadn't recorded anything between Narabiri and Gundiwundi. Safe to say, I went down the other road for the next few trips. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. As a sheer coincidence one night, my older sister's bed broke. I had a double bed, so my parents told us we had to share for the night. No big deal. Probably at around 2 a.m, my sister shakes me awake, saying she needed to go to the bathroom. I told her to go, and said something about, "Why did you wake me up?" She insisted that I go with her to watch the door. That was something we did when we were much younger and afraid of monsters. I again just told her to go and leave me alone. She started to physically drag me from the bed, so I finally caved in and walked with her, and I was pretty much sleepwalking and only woke up when I noticed she was walking right past the bathroom. I asked her where she was going, and she said, to Mum and Dad's room. Now I'm confused. We get to my Mum and Dad's bed, and she starts to wake up Mum. Mum was a super heavy sleeper, so it wasn't surprising when Dad woke up first, slightly annoyed. He asked her what was wrong, and very quietly, nonchalantly, she says that someone crawled into bed with us. Dad sat up and had to ask what she meant, and she said, "Someone crawled into bed with us, Dad. I thought it was you, but it didn't smell like you." Dad immediately jumps up, grabs the revolver he kept under the bed, and heads to my room. I thought my sister was lying, until my dad flipped the light in my room on, and sure enough, there was a man laying in my bed. That woke me up. Dad put the barrel to his forehead and asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing in my son's bed? You better think real good about what you say next." The guy was clearly confused and looked like he was about to crap himself. He rubbed his eyes and started swearing to himself. By now my mother had called the cops and the sirens were getting closer. Dad tells the guy to get up and to walk to the kitchen, all while at gunpoint. The cops arrest him and haul him away. Apparently, what happened was he was a high schooler who had attended a party a few blocks away. He got drunk and started walking to his grandma's house. Her house was north, and he went south. He got to our house thinking it was hers, tried the locks, and got mad, thinking she had locked him out. He punched out the window in the back door, unlocked it from the inside, and made his way to his room to sleep it off. Thankfully, my parents were pretty cool and didn't crucify the kid. They made him pay for the door and requested he attend rehab, which he did. Still, not a great way to wake up. The first was from ages 8 to 9. Living in SoCal, at this condo, with my mother and stepdad. My bed is in one corner of the room, going along the length of it, and the door is on the opposite corner. I wake up in the middle of the night to see a figure leaning against the wall, staring at me by the door. This figure has an evil smile to it, and the closest thing, although silly, that comes to describing how it looks is Darth Maul, but in a black suit. This thing is smiling at me. Being a little kid, I'm freaked, and the only thing I could think to do was to close my eyes, in the hopes that it would go away. So I do this for a handful of minutes and open my eyes. Still there, smiling an evil smile. I immediately closed my eyes, terrified, and somehow, after a long time and perhaps exhausted from the emotions, fall back asleep. I am not a lucid dreamer, and this has never happened again to me. In all fairness, at that point in my life, I was starting to watch adult-grade horror movies. In my defense, Michael Myers was the person I was most scared of, and anything resembling Darth Maul didn't pop up until years later, when the Star Wars movies came out. Technically, there was no reference for me to have at that particular face, subconsciously swimming around in my head. Number 2. Age 15 to 16. Still living in SoCal with my mum in an apartment complex. Normally after my mum went to sleep, I would sneak downstairs and watch TV. Growing up, my mum always had me check the front door before going to sleep, and I remember that while I was drifting off while laying on the couch, I had this nagging feeling to check the door. I was being partially stubborn that night, and was determined to check the door once I actually went to bed for good in my own room. So I'm half asleep, and I'm getting this compelling urge to check the door, waking me up. I remember being angry with myself while dragging myself off the couch to check the door. It was unlocked. I turned the deadbolt to lock it and lay back down on the couch, just relieved that I could finally lay down in peace. Within minutes, I hear the doorknob slightly and subtly jiggling, as if someone were outside checking the doors to see if any were unlocked. I was petrified in fear, and by the time I get the nerve to check through the peephole, there's no one there. I still actually have this feeling from time to time. Third and final story. I was now in my mid-20s, bartending in Vegas, and I'm living in a really nice apartment in this brand new complex. So I must have been like one of the first 25 people there. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, as I was very used to living in apartments. But I did notice I had a string of bad dreams whenever I slept in the bedroom, since I was an established night owl from work. Sometimes I would sleep on the couch with the TV on, then I wouldn't get those dreams. It became such a pattern that within a month, I officially made my couch in the living room my new bed. A few months later, I get a little terrier to keep me company. While the little guy didn't growl or bark into corners, I noticed fairly quickly that if I put the bowl in particular places of the apartment, he flat out wouldn't touch it. The sweet spot ended up being between the laundry room and the bedroom. I'm older at this point, and rationalize that as long as something is not actively trying to give me a heart attack, I can live with the little oddities. After all, the apartment was the nicest setup I've ever had up until that point. I know it's cliché, but things really did pick up after about 3 a.m. The most common thing to happen was the feeling like something was milling around the kitchen behind me. I would hear little noises, most commonly the sound of someone's ankle popping while trying to sneak around. The only way I could sleep was by having the TV at a certain volume so that I couldn't hear it. The craziest thing to happen was one night, right around that magical 3 a.m. mark, my cable, for whatever reason, goes out. I made a snarky remark to the ghost that they could honestly do better, and I shit you not. Right after I said that, the whole power went out of my apartment. The gym complex was open 24/7, so as soon as that happened, I hauled ass out of there and got onto the treadmill until I could see lights go back on in the apartment. I could see my apartment windows from the gym. Now, maybe the place was new, and the electrical wiring was bad, causing me to experience this. But it's weird that it was so consistent in the time it happened for 2 years. I've lived in several places since then, and never had anything like that happen to me. "7 years ago, I lived in a 2-story farmhouse. It was built in 1908 and was both large and old. I was packing clothes and putting them in a small unused bedroom. I was wearing my MP3 player, and the last time I checked, it showed 3/4 battery life. I was on my 4th or so trip and was hauling a load of shirts on hangers. It occurred to me the closet was empty too. Perfect. I'll just hang them back in there. This closet was almost a second room. It had a short, glossy wooden door. The area was thrice as long as wide, with hardwood floors. The lacquer still smelled, even though I'm sure it was fresh 100 years ago. I ducked fully inside and thought, this is a weird little place to be. Suddenly, the music doubled in volume and changed to something that wasn't music. It was like, I don't even know, rapid nonsense, fast electronic babbling. It scared the hell out of me. I flew straight out, looked at my player, and it was dead. I'm a pretty rational guy. That MP3 player could sometimes show more battery life than it actually had. It'd done that before, and maybe the sounds were some sort of malfunction before shutting down. I didn't really believe in ghosts, but I'm telling you, it shocked and frightened me to the core. My skin felt electric for hours after, and I've never felt comfortable in that room again. I believe that my family has a shadow person living in their home, and this is the story that leads me to believe that. I was 13 at the time, and never been a big believer of things that I could not see physically, but I've always been willing to accept changes in my belief. My family lives out in the country in an old house that was one of the first built in this area, back when the only way to get there was by taking dirt roads, which in itself is eerie, considering the house is the equivalent of a mansion. I remember always getting an uneasy feeling being in that house, and will also say that everyone who has ever visited the house has had an encounter with this spirit, from being choked to scratches in threes, to inanimate objects being thrown, shaken so violently that they shake the whole house, to just being leered at eerily. This spirit has been in the house longer than I have, but I digress. One night when I was 13, we turned off all the lights in the house and I went to bed. For those of you who don't know, it is extremely dark in the country at night. This night was no exception. I went to bed around 9 o'clock and abruptly woke up due to an unsettling feeling and looked around uncomfortably until I realized what was causing the feeling. At the foot of my bed, standing almost as tall as my ceiling, I noticed a massive shadowy figure staring at me. His form was somehow darker than normal darkness, and that alone unnerved me. But the one thing I will never forget is his eyes. Somehow his eyes managed to be darker than the rest of his figure, and I paused and held my eyes open for a good 20 seconds, looking at it, trying to form any manner of speech, because immediately I wanted to pray this figure away, but my voice wouldn't come to me. After that long pause of fear, I blinked, and it was gone. I still couldn't find my voice, and could very much still feel it there, watching me. I rolled over, too scared to leave the comfort of my bed, ready to accept whatever might come, and drifted back to sleep. I know that this figure still lives in that house, and for anyone who doesn't know, regularly burning sage helps keep them at bay. But he still comes back any time my family forgets to burn the sage, and I refuse to stay in the guest house because he has taken to staying out there. Everyone who stays at my family's house sees this entity, and we have even had paranormal investigators come to our home and look at it for us. My family still lives in this house, and it is still very haunted and gives you odd feelings and sensations depending on where you go. I'm happy to say I don't live there anymore, and if nothing else, the sage rituals make the tension inside the house go down, but I know that he just waits in the guest house for the next time they forget to do the sage rituals. My grandfather was a state trooper and a detective/accident detective. I have two interesting truck stories from him. There was a group of college kids driving somewhere for spring break, and being distracted one way or another, they hit a semi. He said when he showed up, 3 of them were out of the car, and 1 of them was sitting in the back behind the passenger. The roof of the car had been pretty well peeled back, with most of the damage being on the passenger side of the car. The passenger's shoulder was messed up from the crash, and everyone was sobbing. So no one was really being cooperative when my grandfather asked about the 4th individual. My grandfather walked up to the car to see if the 4th guy needed any help, and he said from behind and on the left he looked fine. But when he got around to the front, the whole right of this guy's head was just destroyed. 2. When I was younger, I was helping my grandfather move his old police filing cabinets, and I was digging through his old photos and files, and stumbled across a guy clearly dead laying on the road. It was pretty gruesome. I inquired about the photo, and he said that the trucker had fallen asleep and fallen out of his truck and ran himself over, cutting himself in half. It was the middle of winter, so he froze to the ground. My grandfather said they had to pretty much scrape him off the floor. We were staying at my boyfriend's parents' house for a few months while they were overseas, and we were saving on rent money. It was once a big, beautiful house, but his parents didn't have the time or money to keep it up. The house was up a long, hilly driveway, surrounded by trees, and the forest had been encroaching on the house for years. The roof needed to be replaced. The pipes needed to be replaced. It was such a shame that this beautiful home was so neglected. We had been talking about scraping up the cash to buy it off them and do it up ourselves, until the incident. We had got a black lab puppy right before we moved in. Unlike most black lab puppies, he was an absolute bundle of energy. Unless he was out cold, he would vibrate at all times, and was constantly running around and tripping up your feet. Typical puppy stuff. One night, I was walking upstairs to our bedroom, and the dog was running up and down the stairs as I walked. I had this weird feeling pass over me just as I was walking, despite not trying to trip over the damn dog. I got to the top and turned around. He had come to a dead stop at the bottom of the stair and was staring up, not at me, at the very middle of the stairs. This dog, that had not stopped jumping since the moment he was born, had come to a complete standstill and was just staring at something that wasn't there. I got really freaked out. I was calling him and slapping my thighs, trying to get him to snap out of it, but it was like he was in a trance. I finally ran down the stairs and picked him up. It wasn't until I took a step back up the stairs that he moved. He started trembling and let out the most pitiful, soul-crushing whine. I sprinted back up the stairs and set him down. He took off as fast as he could and hid under our bed. Now, being the huge skeptic that I am, I ignored the feeling in my gut that something was off, and went to bed, muttering to my boyfriend about how stupid the dog was. We both woke up that night at around 2 a.m. to a loud sound. I sat up groggily and asked my boyfriend what had happened. He didn't know, but he thought that a tree branch must have fallen on the house. He opened the windows to look out. "That's funny," he said. "What?" "There's no wind. There are no clouds either. It's a really clear night." We pondered that for a moment. I didn't say anything to my boyfriend, but the feeling of unease that I had ignored earlier was rising in my stomach. "Holy shit," he whispered. I stared in disbelief. There was a bluish light flashing outside the house. My first instinct was that it was someone coming to rob us. After 4 or 5 flashes, the light disappeared. I asked him in a low whisper if he thought it was a flashlight. He said he didn't think so. It was too bright and such a weird color of light. At that moment, the light flashed again, brighter and bluer. It illuminated our whole room for about a second. It stopped, and we were again in total darkness. Neither of us spoke. The dog started to whine under the bed. I hadn't even noticed he'd gone back under there, and it was the same sad, low whine as before. My boyfriend got down on his knees and began pulling the dog out. That's when we heard the most terrifying noise I will ever hear in my life. The room down the hall from us had previously been his dad's office. They had taken their computer when they left, so all that remained was a bookshelf, a few boxes, and an old printer. There was not a new printer with wireless or Bluetooth capabilities. It was the typical cheap home printer that every family seemed to have in the early 2000s. As my boyfriend was pulling the dog from underneath the bed, we heard the telltale sounds of the printer kicking to life. We both leapt up and ran into the office. The printer was warming up. We heard it pull a sheet. My boyfriend turned on the light, and sure enough, the printer was sat where it had been left. Only the plug had been awkwardly extended across the room and was plugged into the socket closest to us. He reached over and ripped it out. The printer died. Without a single word, we grabbed the still trembling dog and ran downstairs and got into the truck. We showed up at my boyfriend's friend's house a few minutes later and told him we needed to spend the night. When he gave us a look, my boyfriend told him that this was a no questions asked request. He shrugged, got us some blankets, and went back to sleep. We have never discussed this with anyone else, and we only discussed it with each other a couple of times in the day afterwards. There was so much we couldn't rationally explain that we just dropped it. We went back to the house the next day and grabbed our things. I told my parents that the plumbing had finally given out, and we went to stay with my parents while we looked for something else. We never spent another night in that house. I am not a trucker, but I dated a girl who was. She was short haul, but occasionally had to run loads to a warehouse out of state. When she did, I usually tagged along. We pulled into this nasty, abandoned-looking truck stop right on the New Mexico-Texas border for fuel. All fueled up, we headed inside to see if we could get something to eat. The inside of this place looked like something out of Fallout. Mostly empty shelves with random dust-covered canned goods and old boxes of this and that, lights flickering and making that pinging sound. Not a soul to be found. We grabbed a few bags of chips and waited near the register. After making some noise and waiting for maybe 5 minutes, we put the stuff back and went outside. Surrounding her truck were about 10 guys who looked very scary. Remembering I had left my gun in the truck, my stomach dropped. A biker then rolls up and talks to the 2 guys near the back of the truck for a minute, then does the slitting throat motion. My girlfriend is shaking and close to crying. I'm pretty sure I've already crapped my pants. The biker throws his hands up and tells everyone to move, and walks over to us. He then politely tells us that someone had stolen a trailer of his up north, and he was looking for it. This wasn't the one, so he apologized for the drama. He reaches into his pocket, grabs something, sticks it in my hand, and tells me sorry for the trouble. As he's walking away, I look into my hand. It was a bag of weed. We got out of there pretty fast. Good weed though. We were joking about trying to find him on the way back and get some more.
So I had just gotten out of a pretty significant relationship with someone of 4 years. Nearly engaged and moving in together, etc., when things fell apart. I took a good amount of time to be on my own and get my crap together again when my friends began encouraging me to get back out there. Needless to say, I really wasn't wanting anything at that point, nor looking for anything. But they insisted that I at least just go out on a few casual dates, for practice. Just to kind of get my skills back up for when I was ready. I think they were honestly just worried because I had become a bit of a hermit. So I matched with this girl, who's home from college for the summer. She's a little out of the way from me, but was eager to meet. Seemed really interested. Was even willing to come to my area, etc. I really wasn't all that interested, to be truthful, but my friends again encouraged this. Practice, whatever that means. A date doesn't mean commitment, whatever. I want to be very clear though, that I was extremely honest and explicit with her that I was not looking for anything serious, or anything at all. I was very forthcoming that I had gotten out of something serious and I was kind of encouraged to explore. She persisted and still wanted to meet, so we agreed to a casual lunch in a sports bar that week. I get there, and she was already waiting for me. I was a bit put off by how much different she looked than her pictures. Not trying to sound shallow or anything, but her pictures from Tinder easily had to be at least 5 years old, which I verified based on tattoos she had in person versus ones she didn't have in the pictures. So I was a bit thrown off by that. I wasn't the least bit attracted to her, but I was there just to have a new experience anyway, right? No big deal. I felt so bad because the entire time she seemed so incredibly shy and awkward. I even noticed her hand shaking when she reached for her glass, which I found endearing, honestly. So I did my best to get her talking to try and help her feel more relaxed. I asked her questions and chatted about things I figured you'd chat about on dates. Where she grew up, music she's into, school she goes to, major, etc. All to which I literally received one-word answers. It went on like this for about an hour, and she was just not working with me at all. But I tried to keep room in my heart, because it was clear she was feeling anxious, and I understand that from a personal level. So as we finished lunch, and I'm receiving one-word answers, I kind of become a bit suggestive that we should conclude our date by saying I had to get back to feed my animals and do some laundry, etc. But she became very adamant on spending more time and asked if we could do something else. I was genuinely trying to be a decent person, so I agreed, and we found a nearby park to walk. This is where things get weird. We sat on a park bench. Mind you, it's broad daylight. There are kids playing basketball nearby, folks jogging past. I start trying to make conversation yet again, but still get the one-word answers. Then out of seemingly nowhere, without any warning whatsoever, she proceeds to just kiss me really aggressively, tongue and everything. I was honestly just so shocked I stood there frozen, not knowing what the F to do. I had this timid, shy woman who's really not made much conversation with me at all, who was so nervous she's visibly shaking, just turned into a freaking bear, mauling my face in like 6 seconds. My head was spinning with confusion and anxiety. I swear it felt like it lasted forever and I just prayed for it to stop. I was so put off and honestly a bit afraid to do or say anything. Like, what do you even do in that situation? I was just hoping she'd pick up on my very obvious body language that I wasn't reciprocating anything at all. I was completely unprepared for a situation like this. Then some really nasty guy walks by, gawking and catcalling, and literally begins propositioning us into a three-way. I'm just like, what the actual F is going on? I need to get out of here. I was 1,000 different types of uncomfortable. I end up managing to ward him off after telling him politely, no. More than several times. All the while she's just laughing, and I'm thinking, who even are you? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde over here? What the F? So he leaves, and I'm insisting now that I need to leave and go home. She seems to ignore what I'm saying, and gets very close to my face again and says, did you like that? Did you think I'm sexy? Do you want me? When I tell you I was so effing nervous, I was like, I really need to get home. And she was like, can I come? And I told her very firmly, no. She literally tried to persuade me to let her come back to my place with me, and I had to say no more than 3 times. So finally, I'm home, and frankly, just kind of shaken up. I hadn't really done the dating thing in quite a long time, but that felt very abnormal. She then texts me after she gets home and asks me on a second date. And I was very kind, despite being made incredibly uncomfortable, and I told her I thought she was a very cool chick and that I had a nice time. Lie. But that I did not feel there was anything there, and reminded her I wasn't looking for anything. She then text bombarded me a bunch of crazy things, saying how she didn't understand and was so confused that she thought I was so into her and that things went great. I did not respond to any of these because now she's continuing to cross my boundaries. I said what I needed to say, and I thought I was being decent by at least being honest. So the text continued, and I figure they're going to eventually stop. It was a first date. How can someone be so upset over someone not reciprocating on a first date? They did not stop. By the text, you would have thought we had ended a 2-year relationship, and she began calling, at which point I had to block her number. So, nightmare Tinder girl, please, for the love of everything, let's never, ever meet again.
This happened maybe 6 years ago now. I had just graduated college and was working at a little ad agency in my city. I was living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment with my unemployed girlfriend and my unemployed cat. It was a little 6-story building with maybe 20 apartments total just off Main Street. There was no security guard at the entrance of the building, but an automatically locking door that required a key code to enter. The 4th floor was home to a few students and couples, and my apartment was right next to a vacant studio, making it pretty quiet most of the time. After a long night in the office the night before, I didn't feel up for going into work, so I called out and turned off my alarm. I cuddled up to my girlfriend in hopes of sleeping till noon. At around 10 a.m, pounding on my front door woke both of us up, and I went to check it out. "Just a minute," I yelled, as I threw on a shirt and sweatpants, expecting a surprise visit from the maintenance man or something. In my groggy state, I couldn't really tell that anything was off, but I peeked through the peephole and didn't see anyone. Opening the door felt different somehow, and I immediately noticed a large depression in the wall 2 to 3 feet from my door. Looking down, I could see shards of wood that had broken free from the casing around the door, and I noticed the wood beginning to separate at the hinges. The hair on the back of my neck raised as I pieced together the scene. Someone had been trying to kick my door down and was pressing themselves against the wall for support. It scared us both for a while, and we slid a couch in front of the door before bed each night for a few months after that. I'm not sure what their intentions were that day, and we moved soon after. But I could never stop questioning what would have happened if they had heard my girlfriend's voice instead of mine. I was moving back to this city and was going to stay at my parents' house until I was able to find me a place to stay and such. They thought it was a good idea because I could help watch my sister, who is schizophrenic, and help out in that regard. I was helping out and renovating some of the rooms, pulling out the carpets, fixing up the hardwood, doing sheetrock, so on and so forth. I had just gotten finished with hanging the sheetrock in the room, and I would be staying in and was in the kitchen getting some water. The house was a long hallway, and at the very end is a closet with 2 rooms on the right and left. The room I was working in was on the left, and the room on my right my mum used for storage. I mean, packed with extra clothing, house supplies, and whatnot. It was a tight fit to move around in. Anyway, from the kitchen in the hallway, I see someone move from the storage room into my room. They shut the door. No biggie. I knew my parents weren't there, but my sister was possibly there, and it was only her. I make my way to the bedroom door and use the handle and notice it's locked. I knock and ask my sister to open the door because there were no curtains or blinds on the windows, and it was a hot summer's day, and I could see a shadow moving around underneath the door. I knocked and asked my sister to open the door and stop messing around. I had to start mudding the sheetrock, and then the shadow stopped and looked as though it were facing the door. I told her I was going to call our parents. I know, real mature of me, if she didn't open the door. So I called them and carried the phone to the end of the hallway and asked if they didn't mind getting her out of the room. They informed me she was with them. Every hair on my body stood up, and I moved as quickly as I could to get the hell out of that house. As soon as I got to the front door, the door handle was moving, and someone was coming in, and I was about to shit a brick. Fortunately, it was my brother. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him that someone is in the bedroom I was working on. He, having no idea what the hell happened, walked into the room and opened it. It was ice cold in there. The window had fogged up, and for some reason, this freaked him out and made him want to get out as well. I don't think I've ever been afraid like that before. Not sure I have since either, except when I think about it. I've always been a bit of a loner, which is why the thought of being stuck in a truck alone was incredibly appealing to me when picking career paths. I really enjoyed being a trucker, and have been one for the last 40 years. There is one story that always comes to mind, and that is the story of Sally. Now, on my truck routes, I would usually encounter lot lizards, those nasty women just waiting to prey on you. It was at one of these places, when I was having dinner, that I encountered Sally. I'm sure that she was a lady of the night, and when we first met, she was also offering her services. But I told her to sit down and just talk to me for a little while, if she wouldn't mind keeping an old man company. She accepted, and we had dinner, and made polite conversation, and just talked about each other's lives, where we came from, what drove us, why we are where we are today. Honestly, I was just lonely, and enjoyed having the company and listening about her tragic life. I gave her $50. At the end of the meal, I said I had a nice time, slipped her a 50 for her time, and made my way. It became a recurring thing. Whenever I'd pass by, I'd always go in, have dinner, and if Sally were about, invite her too. Don't worry, I didn't pay her anymore, but we became quite good friends, and she'd tell me all the news and gossip from the area, who'd come, who'd gone, any interesting news and like. We really grew a close friendship. Now, despite her choice in profession, she told me she had a boyfriend that lived in this town, but she never told me the name, just that he was comfortable with her choice of career, although not all of the time, and said that he could become violent. I tried to distance myself from that. I didn't want to get involved with her boyfriend or anything. I just wanted polite conversation when I was about. One day, though, she stopped showing up. After about 2 months' worth, I finally asked someone else if they'd seen Sally around. It took a while, but one of the other ladies said that she had disappeared and that no one had seen her for quite a while now. So that was that. My talks with Sally faded into non-existence. But every time I drove by and stopped, I wished that Sally would walk through the doors so we could have a catch-up and a nice chat like we used to. We never did, though. I was sitting in that very same diner, having some food and watching the news on the TV, when something came on. They'd found the remains of a woman at the bottom of a ravine. My heart fell to my stomach. I knew who it was. I didn't need confirmation. In the weeks that followed, did they match her DNA? It was Sally, all right. She'd been strangled, stabbed, and thrown down, left to die, which she did. It was her boyfriend, the boyfriend with violent tendencies. The first time I saw his face was the mugshot on the news. How could someone be so cruel? I don't know what happened to him. I guess I didn't follow the case enough. I hope he got what he deserved, though. You can choose to believe me or not. I know what I heard, and no one can take away my truth. We did some moving around when I was in middle school. After a few places didn't work out, we ended up in an average-sized 3-bedroom in Southern California. I had problems from day one. After spending all day helping my parents move in the last of our things, I nestled into my room, full of boxes, and watched The Empire Strikes Back, since there was no cable and I was having trouble sleeping. My TV was next to the open door, and just as I began to doze off, I saw a bottle tossed into the room at hip level from the pitch black hallway. I heard footsteps leading towards the living room, which was opposite of the rest of the bedrooms. After calling out to my mother, father, and sister for a bit, I turned on the lights and found no one in the living room or kitchen. After waking up my parents, who I assumed were being mean to me, they told me that they'd been dead asleep and neither of them could fake the snoring. My sister, who was also dead asleep, barely remembers being woken up that night. I showed my mum the bottle, and she wrote it off as being mine and falling from a box. The thing is, this was a Gatorade bottle, filled with water, and it had what I call Indito Spanish scribbled in it. The day after, we began to put away the yard tools and make use of the shed. The backyard shed was full of all sorts of different bottles of all shapes and sizes, filled to the brim with water and covered in scribbles. It looked like someone had lived there at some point. My sister had a reoccurring incident that would make my hairs stand up just by recalling it. After we went through the trouble of dumping all of the water bottles and unpacking within the first week, my sister brought something to my attention. She shared a wall with the garage, and one night at 4 a.m, she made me wake up to something that as an adult I still can't write off. She shook me awake and took me into a room and asked me to be very quiet. In the Mexican community, it is very common for many to gather a week before a funeral after someone has died to take part in a Catholic prayer. Among other prayers during the night of this tradition, they say a rosary worth of Hail Marys. And through the vent of my sister's room, you could hear what sounded like several older women chanting Hail Mary in unison in hushed tones. We did not share a building with anyone else. It was a 3-bedroom house, and after a few minutes of listening and not being able to move, I took my sister to my parents' room and asked my mum and dad to come and listen. When they knelt down to listen, my sister said in an average speaking voice, "Listen, Mum, they're in the garage." And I swear to this day, my mum and dad heard a chorus of "shh" coming from the vent. My dad was of course enraged, and being that I was maybe 14 at the time, it was up to us to brave the garage and see who was there. My dad flung open the garage door and found no one. Like I said, I don't need validation from lying to you. I know what I saw, and that's enough for me. When I was a kid, my brother and I would get stuck with babysitting the neighbour's kid. His name was Alex. Alex was really fond of my Lego set that I had in the corner of my room, facing the window. He would play for hours, staying preoccupied, while my brother and I would play video games in the living room. So one night when I fell asleep on the couch while babysitting, my brother came by to me and said, "Alex is under your bed shaking." I asked, "What's wrong with him?" My brother told me to follow him to the room and try to talk him back out from under the bed. I go inside and find him on the verge of tears as he's trembling profusely under my bed. I asked him, "What's wrong? Why are you under there?" He whimpered, "Him," while looking at the sliding closet. As I walked towards the bed in order to help him out, he ran. He ran all the way back over to his house and waited on his front steps until his parents got home. Now, my parents were out to dinner with his, and he explained the whole story in detail to both his parents and mine. His explanation sent shivers down my spine when my brother and I left the house to meet up with his parents and find out what happened. My mum told me that Alex was playing with my Legos and heard a slight murmur from my closet, something that resembled a faint vocalization of, "Come here." He said that he looked behind him and noticed the closet had a slight opening with a light peering out from my lamp. He stared at the crack until he saw an eyelid open. He told us there was a man in my closet, and Alex then hid under the bed, and he gave out a slight yelp, which attracted my brother's attention. My family rushes back to my house, and in horror, we find my closet door rocked open and a few things missing. My window had been left open when it was previously closed. A few things had been knocked over which hadn't previously been touched. We still didn't know what force we were reckoning with after that event. Thank God that nothing more severe happened. When I was around 13, my family moved to a 3-story house in Ohio, a colonial type situated a block away from the rail yard of a large and reasonably busy steel mill. A pretty old house, some 80 years or so at the time, if I remember correctly. I remember the first time I saw it after it had been bought, and we did a little tour of the inside, and I noticed with some distress that almost every single interior door, bedrooms, bathrooms, attic, heck, even the hall closet, had deadbolts on them, on both sides of the door. The couple of doors that did not have them had scarred areas on the jambs where deadbolts obviously had been mounted at some time in the past. This didn't make any sense to us at all, although we more or less just brushed it off. But it never stopped nagging me. As part of our general house fixing up work, we removed all of the deadbolts, but even doing that just made me more uncomfortable rather than less. Removing the locks, without knowing why they had been put up in the first place. But my father told me to just stop worrying about it. A month or so after we had settled in, I was in my room, the third floor attic, during a storm. It wasn't night time yet, but it was heading in that direction. The attic wasn't creepy at all. I'd actually requested it for my room. It was quasi-finished, the wood roof beams and insulation being covered with slanted walls made out of painted pegboard. Its floor plan was as big as the whole house, even if the very edges where the roof met the floor weren't usable spaces. And I thought it was great. Anyway, I was laying in bed, my headboard just under the twin windows that faced the front of the house. It was extremely windy outside, and the house was talking and groaning with the wind, as old houses will, and I was pretty much just dozing off. Suddenly, from just above and behind my headboard, there was a huge crashing sound. Bang, kabang, right against the wall. I actually fancied I felt the vibration through the bed. It sounded like something huge and heavy, like a sledgehammer had just knocked violently on the outside wall next to my window. My third floor windows. It startled the hell out of me, and I turned around and tried to look out the window to see if I could find any clue as to what had caused the sound, but I could find none. And while the house continued to creak and sway in the wind, there were no other loud knocks that night. After some time, I fell back to sleep, half wondering if I dreamt the whole thing, and I pretty much ended up forgetting about it as time went by. Many months, not quite a year later, it happened again. Another fresh and breezy thunderstorm, this time at night, and I was leaning in my bed up against the headboard end, watching the storm outside. Lots of lightning. I loved storms in general, and still do. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was gusty and slinging it against the window, so my view was somewhat distorted by the constantly running water. Something caught my attention some distance away. Just beyond the steel mill rail yard were a set of gigantic, yellow, movable gantries, used, I believed, to lift stacks of metal sheets or rods or plates or whatever onto flatbed trailers for trucks to come and haul away. I could see these silhouetted in the distance when the lightning flashed, and for a few moments I seemed to see what looked like some large thing moving around on top of one of the gantries. It was impossible to tell through the wavering river of water that was constantly pouring down the storm window, but I looked intently, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Suddenly again, there was a gust of wind and a crackling sound, and the storm windows, the aluminium frame, windows, screen, the whole kit, was yanked off the front of the house, inches away from my face. tumbling down and crashing onto the porch roof below. It took me a second or two to register what had just happened, and then I got right up against the window itself, my nose and forehead pressed against the glass, trying to see down to where the storm window had landed. While I was there, that's when it struck again. A terrific sharp blam, right there where my face was. I could feel the glass tremble with the bang against my face, and even the window frame where my hands were braced shook with force. Something invisible smashing against the front wall and windows of my bedroom. I jumped back in a panic off my bed, scrambled down the steps into the second floor hallway, shut my door, and just stood there like an idiot, not knowing what to do. I thought about the deadbolt that had been on the inside and outside of every freaking door in the house when we moved in, and wondered if whatever had just attacked me was the reason those had been put in. That's what it felt like to me at the time, an attack of some sort. I paced quietly. I was pretty much a wreck, but my instinct to not start yelling and wake up my parents so that I couldn't get told off was great enough to keep me collected at least. I don't know how long it took me to settle down, but after no further loud noises and the storm abating, I went back to my room and pulled my bed in the opposite direction, as far away from that end as those windows as practically possible. The next day after school, I spent a lot of time rearranging my room. I didn't put anything near those damned windows. I didn't want to have to go near them again. And maybe it worked. I never heard any knocking against that wall after that night. Maybe whatever it was had gone. Maybe moving my bed away from the wall appeased it. I don't know. I didn't care. I was happy. In time, as the years passed, I put the incidents out of my mind. Now, if I want to be completely honest, many years later, purely by happenstance, I managed to find a rational explanation for the banging sounds. However, I never found any kind of rational explanation for those deadbolts on the doors. What prompted whoever it was to install them, or why he or she felt they were needed on every single door, on both sides of every single door in the house. I think about it once in a while to this day, and it never fails to give me the creeps. I found out just a couple of years ago, in fact, when I was helping fix up the place so my father could sell it. I was taking down the pegboard in the attic so we could put some new insulation up and under it. And when I moved the piece under the window, these two and very heavy, corroded-looking brass rods fell onto the floor. They were the old window sash counterweights. The cloth ropes attaching them had dry rotted through, and the wind shaking the house finally jarred them loose. The bangs were these things falling and hitting the floor behind the pegboard, one at a time.
I'm a lesbian. I'm one of those girls who you would never guess is gay. I'm what they call in the gay community a femme, a gay woman who is very feminine, no short hair, etc. You get the drift. In 2016, I had a rather unpleasant breakup with my first love, whom I was with on and off for 3 years. She was actually the first woman I've ever been with, so you can imagine being so young and naive, this experience wasn't the best. Several months had passed of crying and being a general depression mess, until my loneliness and eager to love again brought me to Plenty of Fish, the dating app. I joined and I had the occasional messages from strangers such as, "Oh my god, as if you're gay," or a man would slide in my messages with general perverted messages. I was thinking of deleting it just after I'd only been on it for 2 weeks. I received a message from, let's call her Alice, one evening. Now she looked beautiful, long black hair, blue eyes, tall, and had what seemed a cracking personality which instantly caught my eye. We spoke for 3 weeks via WhatsApp, and then leading on to phone calls, etc. The usual exciting stuff which eventually leads up to a meet-up, which we decided to do. I met her on an evening outside one of my city's gay bars. I walked out of the taxi to be greeted by 2 unknown people. I remember thinking, what the hell? A ginger-haired boy and a tiny woman with glasses. Now she must have only been around literally 4'8". Being stunned to meet them, I say, hey, and we all sat down. Now Alice was inside and I could see her, and she looked rather different from her half figure I could see. She slowly came out and she looked almost a different person. She had short brown hair, brown eyes, and was very top heavy. Not exactly the best date when you feel you've been catfished. However, I didn't want to be rude as I'm a bit of a people pleaser that way. I stayed and we spoke. Now she told me she had a hair disorder where it fell out and she literally shown me bald patches, so she admitted she wore wigs. And that's what she wore in her pictures. As for her eyes, she put on, daily, blue eye contacts. I must admit, this kind of made me think literally what the hell. Don't ask me why, but I ended up going back with her and those 2 friends and we got drunk. And I ended up sleeping with her. I know, stupid, right? The next day, hungover, I peeled myself out ready for my train back to my city, and I was bombarded with text messages saying, I had a great time, and when can I see you again? But then it proceeded to, so, when will you be my girlfriend? Bearing in mind these texts were sent almost one after the other. I kind of didn't want to be mean, so I said I'll meet again maybe when I'm free and dragged my hangover ass on the train home. The next day, she wanted to meet me again. So I said, okay, being bored and again not wanting to be mean. I guess looking back now, I just like the idea of that someone liked me again. Now let me tell you, this woman, for the next 2 years of dating, brought hell into my life. Violence, cheating, and almost to the point of me being killed. Yes, quite a story turn. So we dated. Don't ask me why. I honestly just rushed into something because I mentioned I liked the intention she gave. She seemed okay for the first 2 months and so, and then the hell really began. She was taking drugs now. These drugs aren't the type like weed, let's put it that way. She would disappear and be gone for 3 days, sometimes with friends taking drugs, which led her to lying and me finding out through her friends' Snapchat stories. When I had had enough, I went to her mum's house and spoke to her calmly about how maybe it was time it ended. I didn't love her, and to be honest, she was lying, taking drugs, and I also caught text messages on her phone from other women, so yep, I was kind of done. Once I told her my true feelings, she threw me on the bed, held me down and strangled me until I literally turned blue. Now, I'm only a small being, 5'5" at the time, and her being 5'11", you can kind of imagine my frame matched against her much bigger one. After she choked me to the point of complete panic, she ran and grabbed a box of paracetamols and swallowed each tablet in front of me until the whole box was gone, and with her dark eyes gazing into mine, she whispered, "This is your fault." I panicked and made her throw up the pills and cried about how I was sorry. To be honest with you, I was terrified of her. After this event, I stayed due to the fear of her killing herself and her choking me out or worse. Not even a month after, whilst I was staying at her mum's, she locked me inside her house after a dispute. I ran to grab the telephone and she threw it so hard against the wall it literally shattered into pieces. I, being already an anxious person, had a full-blown breakdown and cried. She came up to me with a friggin' knife, held it to my stomach, and I shit you not, her eyes were demonic black, the kind of dead eyes you see in these serial killers. I honestly thought she was going to kill me, and just like a light being switched off, she completely changed to being nice and held me, asking why I was crying. Really? I knew this girl was nuts. I knew I had to leave, or else she would one day surely kill me. So a few months passed of her occasionally hitting me, slapping me, but I just needed to find a way out. So a miracle happened where a girl she was cheating with contacted me with some abuse, such as "Alice hates you and she's mine now," via text. I pretended to be angry and used this as my escape. I finally had a reason to leave, so I left. Once home, I blocked her number, blocked her Facebook, and I actually felt an absolute peace come over me. I got a new job a month later and things actually started looking up. New friends, fresh environment, etc. Until one day, into the first month of my work, who did I receive an email of? Only Alice, stating she had stolen my house key and she was going to come into my house when I was asleep and burn me and my family alive. Trust me on this one, she would have. Me totally forgetting I couldn't find my house key for months, so that totally made sense. She actually did take it. Now I was in full panic mode. I cried in front of my new teammates and they finally got it out of me on what the emails were actually about. Going home and explaining to my mum what actually occurred that day, we spoke of going to the police and showing the emails as evidence. On that night, adding insult to injury, my friend had messaged me and told me Alice had put my private photos, and I mean nudes, all over her Snapchat and practically shown everyone who knew me. Let's just say that once the police got involved, she crapped her pants like the bully that she is and officially, finally left me alone. It's been 3 years since Alice, and after the breakup I was broken, confused, spent most of my days indulging in alcohol. Please people, please, if I can help any of you, don't ever let loneliness or the sorrow for someone who wears a mask overtake your morals. This is a story which almost broke me, so always make sure that if you do get a bad vibe or if they strike you once, please make sure that you leave and that you do not do what I have done.
We are renting a house right now that tends to be a bit spooky here and there. One night, my girlfriend and I went to bed as usual. We have the master bedroom and it has a bathroom attached to it. The door to the bathroom only has the ability to lock if you press this little button behind the handle from the inside. So I closed the bathroom door like every night, and so I know it wasn't locked when I closed it. We went to sleep, and I ended up having a pretty sketchy dream. The dream started in my childhood home, and I was in my sister's room, and was looking out the doorway into the hallway, and saw a bright light with a shadow figure clearly around the corner, standing in front of the light. I didn't hesitate, and ran to the hall to fight whatever it was. As I turned to face the figure, I swung at what I would consider an extraterrestrial, which was all black and the face was terrifying. The alien was also giving off some kind of black smoke, gas-like substance off its body. As soon as my hand hit its body, I went right through it, and time slowed down, and my arm completely slowed down, and I realized I couldn't even touch this being, so I noped out and woke up. I went back to sleep, and when I woke up for work, I went to go into the bathroom to take a shower, and the bathroom door was locked. There was no lock on the outside, so I couldn't get in. During the commotion, I woke up my girlfriend and asked her if she had locked the door. She said no, and then mentioned that she had a scary dream. I said that it was weird as I had had one too. She started off by saying, I was in my childhood house. My jaw drops instantly. She says that she was there for someone's birthday, but after looking around the house, no one was there. So she decided to leave the house, and as soon as she got to the front door, she was locked in, and something was coming up from behind her. She struggled with the door and could not get it to open, and started to panic because whatever was behind her was coming really quick. Before it could get to her, she woke up because she could not bear to turn around and see what it could have been. We never figured out how the door locked itself, and just to add to the weirdness, the bathroom is on a motion sensor, and it will turn on in the middle of the night for no reason. I turned down the sensitivity, but it still turns on here and there, which could be technological flaws, but strange regardless. I am 19 years old today, and I want to mention that this happened while I was in elementary school, perhaps 3rd or 4th grade. I was definitely a lot younger. At the time, I lived in an apartment complex, and I was on the 2nd floor of the building. I lived with my mother, father, and my cat. The apartment wasn't small, but it wasn't huge either. 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, with a living room and kitchen that were connected, and of course, being on the 2nd floor, we had a cute little balcony outside that you could access from the living room. So, I had overheard my mum talking about more than a few break-in attempts that had happened in the other building of the complex. Of course, being a kid, I heard everything. And though I remember most things I heard, they never really stuck with me or were processed in my mind. I was in my own little world. Plus, nothing like that had ever really happened to me before. So, why would it now? Right? I had been in a particularly good mood the day this happened. I had everything go my way, and nothing world-ending like losing my favourite rainbow pencil or breaking my butterfly-painted binder had happened. I went to school, had fun, came home, played with my friends, and even stopped by the complex's office to get some of the candy they always had in a huge dish on the table in front of the entrance. Before I knew it, the day was over, and I was ready for bed. I fell asleep quickly with no worries, hoping I'd have another great day tomorrow. I woke up at about 12:30 or 1 a.m. that night to go to the bathroom and get a drink. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a juice, and walked into the living room area and looked out the glass door onto the balcony, where I noticed my mother forgot to shut the blinds. I tiptoed towards the door and began to close the blinds when I saw a ladder propped up against the railing of the balcony. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face up to the window so that I could make sure I was actually seeing what I thought I saw. I was right. There it was, the top of a ladder. I was about to go and wake my mum and ask her where the ladder came from, when I saw a hand reach up the last bar of the ladder. I didn't necessarily know that whoever's that hand belonged to was trying to break into my house, but I had the most gut-wrenching feeling that they weren't supposed to be climbing up my balcony at this time, or any time for that matter. I felt like I had to act fast, like by the time I went and got my mother, they would already be prepared to hurt me and my parents. I did the only thing I could do to scare them off. I flipped the balcony light off and back on again. Before I even had time to flick the light again, I heard the ladder fold back up and saw about 4 or 5 guys take off across the parking lot that my balcony overlooked. Then I saw something that horrified me. They were all carrying bats and crowbars, and one of them even had what looked like a pistol in his hand. I thought about running and telling my mum, and I honestly didn't know why I didn't. I ran back into my room and hid under the covers and stayed awake for hours, listening for anything that might be something else trying to break in, and I eventually, somehow, fell asleep. I didn't tell my mother until years later for some reason, and I haven't had a break-in experience since. That's it though. Thanks to everyone who took the time to hear this, and to the guys who tried to break into my apartment. Let's not meet. This incident happened at my dad's house a couple of years ago. Somewhat relevant to the story, my parents are still married, but live apart because of their work situations. They often see each other on weekends. My dad lives in a town of about 25,000 people, and it's pretty blue collar for the most part. His house is in the downtown area, which has been regentrified, so it's not a bad area to live in. But it's also just a stone's throw away from the worst part of town. My dad's house is also directly across the street from the main entrance to a university. So there is a university secure checkpoint just a few stops away from his front door that is manned by real police officers 24/7. My dad's house is older and has a detached garage in the back. His backyard is surrounded by a brick wall with 2 wrought iron gates, neither of which have a lock on them, since everyone usually enters through the back door. It's really just inconvenient to have a padlock on the back gates that you constantly have to lock and unlock come rain or shine. The garage door can only be opened using a key code. Inside the back gate, on the side of the garage, is a small crawl-through space that was covered with a board at the time. We have no idea why this little weird space was put there, unless it once housed an AC unit for the previous owner's workshop in the garage. One weekend, my mum arrived and visited, and was looking through the garage for some of her things she had stored there. She was particularly looking for a large floral duffel bag where she stored her sewing machine. Her sewing machine was still in the garage, but the floral duffel was nowhere to be found. She asked my dad where it was, assuming that he had used it as a suitcase, since he does often travel overnight occasionally for work. He told her that he hadn't touched it, and that it should still be in the garage where she left it. They both shrugged it off, assuming that one of them had misplaced it and forgotten where it was. Fast forward a couple of weeks later. My mother is back to visit my dad, and I'm also there with my daughter. My dad walks out the back door one morning and notices the board on the little crawl-through space was damaged, as if someone had been kicking it in. He decided to go into the garage to investigate. Soon after, he called my mum and I into the garage to see what he had found. There was a piece of rolled up newspaper that was charred black on one end. Someone had opened the back gate at night, kicked in the board over the crawl-through space, and lit a piece of newspaper on fire to use as a torch, as they glanced around the garage for, presumably, anything valuable. And the freaky part, they did all of this within 100 meters of a police security checkpoint, while all 4 of us were sleeping just outside the back door. And we were lucky they didn't find the spare house key hung on a nail inside the garage. My dad put 2 and 2 together and realized that this was probably the burglar's second entrance into the garage. A couple of weeks before, when my mum's floral duffel bag disappeared, my dad had noticed that the board covering the crawl-through space seemed loose, and had taken steps to tack it from the inside. He assumed that the burglar originally entered through the same space and stole the duffel bag, either planning to use it to store items that he would steal from other houses, or use it upon his return to my dad's garage a couple of weeks later to gather items of value. Perhaps he was spooked the first time and ran off. After the second incident, my dad had thicker boards nailed to the inside and outside of the crawl space. It remained untouched ever since. But to this day, my mum always thinks twice before opening that garage door when it's dark out. And my dad keeps a baseball bat right next to the back door. We're just glad the guy's makeshift newspaper torch didn't provide him enough light to find the spare house key and enter while we were asleep in our beds that night. This story goes back 3 months or so. For background, my wife and I live in a gated community in the city of Chicago. Because of this, we see very few people in our neighborhood outside of fellow homeowners. We have an 8-year-old husky / German Shepherd mix who thinks he's more lapdog than guard dog. The only time he barks is at the 2 neighbors' dogs every day at 7:30 a.m., 1 p.m. and 10 p.m. as they walk out and back in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, he strongly dislikes those 2 dogs and angrily barks at them, despite years of us trying to get him to stop. Outside seeing those dogs, he's the most calm and friendly dog out there. Every so often, our dog will see or hear the occasional raccoon or possum on our back deck and do a more excited and upbeat bark, the kind where he wants us to let him out to go snag some fresh city pest. This may happen 2 or 3 times a year. This brings us to August or September. I am awoken by my dog barking at the back door, and it does not sound like a familiar bark of his. This barking continues and becomes more intense. It has an urgency and a sound of peril I have not heard before from him. I look at my clock, and it's about 2:30 a.m. This is incredibly abnormal, and I begin to feel very uneasy. Our bedroom faces the back of our house, so I go to the window and glance out, down onto the deck. Living in the city, it's never fully dark out. This, combined with the glow from our kitchen under cabinet lights we leave on as night lights, allow me to see a hooded man standing at my back door. His hands are at his sides, and he's staring into my house, seemingly oblivious to the sounds of my dog, who is clearly threatened by him. He's not leaning towards the door, straining to see what might be inside, as if trying to decide whether we're worth robbing. He's just standing there erect, with his hands straight down his sides. I grab my phone and go to the home app to turn on my outdoor string lights hung above the deck, which I have on a smart outlet. The lights come on, and the hooded man startles. He looks around to his sides and behind him, then runs off through my neighbor's yard, never to be seen again. I was driving in the middle of the night. I was doing a very long shift, and admittedly was over hours. I was running a little late, as my previous stop had taken a bit longer than I had anticipated, and I'd run into some trouble in a gas station, as I'd left my wallet in my chassis, and it took a while to go back, explain it all, and pay, and yada yada. Anyway, point being, I was running late, and I was trying to get to the drop-off point as quickly as possible. I was exhausted and really wanted sleep, but I kept on going, knowing that I was nearly there, and I would be rewarded by sweet slumber soon enough. The roads were empty. This was your typical desert highway, with absolutely nothing around you. The moon was high in the sky, partially illuminating the beautiful landscape as I drove in the dark, alone and with my thoughts. There were times when I found myself almost nodding off, and I had to keep downing that monster to keep myself awake and banging out the mad tunes as you do. I looked at my clock. Barely an hour to go. I knew I could make it, but I told myself I really needed a cigarette break, and honestly, 3 to 5 minutes would be fine. So I slow down on the side of the highway, making sure that I am safe, and get out and light my cigarette. I stand there and walk around my truck, just doing a check absent-mindedly while finishing my puff. I look about. It's beautiful. There are no sounds other than the wind gently brushing against me, and I feel completely at peace as I suck on my cancer stick. Just before I'm about to enter my truck again, do I look up at the moon and into the distance, and just take in this peaceful scene for a few more moments. That's when I hear it. I hear someone, at least I think someone, in the distance. It sounds like voices in the distance. Is it a car with the windows down? I tune my ears. It's coming from the desert, not the highway. I look out and see some lights pinpointing in the distance. They seem to be approaching. I start to get freaked out. Lights in the desert aren't a good thing. I slowly make my way back up into my truck and turn on the engine. From this higher viewpoint, I look again. The lights are certainly coming this way. I assumed that they were cars, but upon staring at them for a few more moments, did I notice that they certainly couldn't be. The path was all wrong. They were just going all over the place. It didn't seem possible that a motor vehicle could sway that much, and yet they kept on approaching. I estimated now that they must be about a mile away, and I genuinely didn't fancy seeing what would happen when they arrived. I started my truck, but it wouldn't turn on. It was like it was dead. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't turn on. I was starting to brick it. Did my truck break down in the middle of nowhere? Not only was I going to miss my delivery, but these spooky lights were scaring the hell out of me. I looked over. They were getting closer. A growing sense of panic and urgency swept over me as I kept fumbling with the keys, trying and trying again to get this thing started. Nothing. Fear overcame me. It was getting to the point where I was accepting my fate, that I was going to be taken by some supernatural force. The lights, their arrival was imminent. They were getting brighter and brighter, and just as they approached the road, did they zoom past and continue on through the desert. I twisted my head, and they kept on going. They weren't cars. I don't even know what they were. Like pure light, just bounding through the desert at impossible speeds. They kept on going and going, and I stared at them for about 2 minutes, thankful that they hadn't stuck around. I tried turning the key once more, and my truck started. I could have cried in that moment. I was so scared. I wasted no time in driving way past the speed limit and making my destination on time. I'm not sure what it was, but the fear and adrenaline sure gave me the kick I needed, and I didn't need a single sip of Monster the whole ride back.